This is a presentation of Michigan State University's Knight Center for Environmental Journalism.
Welcome to Environment.
The Great Lakes was like the lungs of the nation. It was wetlands, grasslands, incredible numbers of wild animals. In the 18th century, you still have reports of explorers in the Great Lakes marveling at the amount of wildlife and the amount of fish life. It's only at the end of the 18th century, really the beginning of the 19th century, that you see this phenomenal change where the Midwest becomes the industrial heart of the nation, where you begin to have that real demand for cheaper forms of transportation.
The people of the region around the Great Lakes are chafing and fretting under chains that bind and hinder them. They demand the means of reaching the Atlantic, either by the St. Lawrence or the Hudson, and they will not be satisfied with less than 20 feet of water from Duluth to the sea. Julian Ralph, Harper's Magazine, 1892.
You know, when we opened the St. Lawrence Seaway, it was an engineering marvel. It is to this day. It's really remarkable to see, these locks lift and lower ships. But economically, it's been an underachiever, and environmentally, it's just been a disaster for the Great Lakes. It possibly has caused the greatest freshwater disaster, environmental disaster in the world.
Along with the substantial increases in human activity, the Great Lakes watershed has experienced a virtual explosion of exotic organisms. Some of the most environmentally and economically disruptive of these have been introduced since the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway.
An invasive, by definition, is something that's non-native. It establishes and then spreads.
The largest threat from these exotic species has paralleled the ease of access into the area. Since the 1800s, more than 1,000 exotic organisms of all types, including plants, fish, algae, and mollusks, have made the Great Lakes Basin their home away from home. The speed in which these organisms have been introduced has seriously disrupted the existing natural balance and are considered by many to be bad company.
This stuff is never going to go away. These invaders that are here now, they're never going to leave. They're always going to be here. It's a question of the balance of the ecosystem that we have to be worried about. We have been affected by invasives for a long, long time. The first real problem was the lamprey, followed by the alewife, and then followed by the various mussels, zebra mussel, quagga mussel that we're dealing with today, and the threat of the Asian carps coming up the Mississippi. This is a long-standing issue in Michigan and a big problem that has not been adequately dealt with by the federal government.
In sheer size, the Great Lakes watershed system is practically incomprehensible. It contains about 18% of the surface fresh water on Earth. and covers an area of 94,000 square miles. Only the polar ice caps contain more fresh water.
And we started by asking, who are the potential players? Who are the exotic organisms that are present in Michigan? And it turns out that we've cataloged about 1,200 exotic organisms in Michigan. That's a low end of the estimate. These are things that we're absolutely sure are exotic and are here. And that number the real number is probably quite a bit larger than that.
And the seaway sort of turned the Great Lakes into a North American beachhead for some of these species to establish in the Great Lakes, and now they're spreading across the continent. When we opened the St. Lawrence Seaway, we allowed ocean freighters from around the world to come into the Great Lakes for the first time. And these ships, if they're not fully loaded with cargo, can carry up to 3 million gallons of ballast water. And this is water from ports around the world. It's teeming with aquatic life. And they would bring that into the Great Lakes. And when they took on cargo in a Great Lakes port, they would discharge this ballast water. So the best way to think of it is sort of like bringing a giant aquarium from Europe or Africa or Asia, bringing it to the Great Lakes and dumping it into the Great Lakes. And you get these new species, and not all of them take hold. Most of them don't cause much damage, but there have been a few really bad actors that have really transformed the ecosystem, have caused major damage.
To understand the enormous changes that have taken place in and around the Great Lakes Basin requires a journey back to when it last began. About 110,000 years ago, it was a pristine, icy, cold environment. The crystal blue waters were locked up as part of what scientists called the Wisconsin Ice Age. The ice slowly and relentlessly scoured to the south and east, ripping, gouging, and actually compressing the earth itself.
The basin of the Great Lakes is underlain by bedrock, and that bedrock is not all the same. In some places the bedrock is very hard. It's difficult for a glacier to erode that surface. But in other places you have soft rocks, like shales. And when glaciers advance, it's fairly easy for them to scour out those shales. The last glaciation, as the ice retreated and exposed these basins, those basins filled up with water, and those lakes just expanded as the ice retreated backwards. And during the last deglaciation, what happened is the ice backed off and advanced and backed off, almost like a yo-yo, with each advance not reaching the point of the previous advance. And so the lake levels go up and down, and sometimes the outlets get blocked by advancing ice, and that causes the lake levels to go up. And so there's a lot of dynamics that come into play with lake levels as the ice retreats.
And the glaciers didn't really leave Michigan completely until about 9,000, 9,500 years ago, and there was still ice on Lake Superior at the time. As they retreated, you saw, a lot of glacial runoff, high winds, that kind of thing. But as soon as they started to move further north, various kinds of species, plants in particular, but also the animal species that fed on those plants moved into Michigan. And some of the earliest hunters that came in were small groups of big game hunters who subsisted primarily, it appears, on the caribou, but some people would argue too that what they were doing was scavenging or maybe even actively hunting mastodon, as a food source, but of course incorporating early plants into that as well. And there was a pretty substantial shift as the megafauna died out, as the mastodon became extinct. People shifted to more woodland kinds of resources, forest resources. And in that process, they exploited, an abundance of different kinds of nuts, including, hickory and walnut and acorn and those kinds of things. Lots of different berries. They began to fish in the streams and the lakes. And we're still highly mobile, though. So it was a mixed hunting and gathering kind of thing. And some of the food could actually be stored. Things like nuts were probably being stored during this so-called archaic period, which lasted until about 3,000 years ago.
As the glaciers began to subside, the meltwater created a colossal inland lake that geologists referred to as Lake Agassiz.
Indeed, there was a sixth Great Lake at one time, and it's called Glacial Lake Agassiz. And this lake occurred west of the present-day Great Lakes, covered much of the area of the Dakotas and Saskatchewan in Canada. And it was relatively shallow, but quite large.
Glacial moraine barriers hemmed in the lake. During various times and at different locations, these natural dams would give way, releasing unimaginable amounts of ice-cold fresh water.
There has been work done in Lake Superior where an estimate has been established as to how much of a lake level rise would have occurred in Lake Superior during the outburst of Glacial Lake Agassiz. And if I remember correctly, this was about a 90-foot rise in lake level, occurring very, very rapidly within, say, a few weeks.
That must have been an amazing thing for somebody who was out caribou hunting one day with a throwing spear in some pretty nasty post-glacial environment, and then all of a sudden Lake Agassiz breaks loose and floods the Lake Superior Basin. That must have been absolutely amazing. And that's the kind of change which, Grandpa will tell you about. When I was young,
after the first contact, there were dramatic impacts. Probably the very first would have been the diseases that were brought by the Europeans when they made first contact with the Native Americans. Measles, the flu, chickenpox, smallpox. These are diseases that had never been known to the original inhabitants of what is now the United States, and had devastating effects.
Along the eastern seaboard, when Europeans arrived, they brought with them diseases which many Indian villages had never previously experienced. Those diseases were often called virgin soil epidemics. They'd never experienced them before. So someone coming in and arriving in an Indian village might bring whooping cough or measles. Indians didn't have immunity to those diseases. So when someone arrived infected with that disease, it could kill up to 90% of the people in that village.
There would have been a huge change to the native people with the introduction of technology, iron pots, flint strikers, things like this.
And along with that, of course, what comes with it? I mean, the horse, cattle, European plants, as well as an enormous array of technology, including firearms, brass kettles, iron, all sorts of things like that.
They brought all kinds of different forms of poultry with them. And many of those animals really threaten the supply of the animals already existing in the Great Lakes. Many Europeans came here because they had exhausted their natural resources, and they took advantage of our natural resources. So we were, in a sense, the natural resource bucket for European development. The reason people were coming from the East Coast is many of them had literally transformed their farms from being fairly fertile to being sterile. And so they came into the Great Lakes seeking inexpensive and highly fertile lands. Because of the way in which Indians had lived on that land was available. Once you begin to intensively farm that land, is probably the time at which you create the greatest change in the Great Lakes.
Originally, the native people had the idea of only taking what you need from the natural resources of the area. The fact of the matter is, why would you take more than what you need? It's work to gather natural resources, and if you don't need it, why put the effort into it?
There isn't any sense for many Americans coming into the Great Lakes in the 19th century that this was a limited environmental landscape. Most people who moved into the Great Lakes thought the landscape was rich and unending.
We find that the French are basically driven out of the area. The English obtain control of this region. Then we have the American Revolution, where the American government takes control. And we find that America begins to grow at a very rapid rate.
I mean, Europeans come in to the Americas, and it is primarily, it's not simply colonization, there's a large economic component to it. They're here for a reason. And that in part it's to find things that they can make a profit from.
Beginning in the 18th and through the 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution marked a major turning point in human history. And because of it, humankind's relationship with the planet was dramatically changed. Energy from wind, water, and wood was replaced by fossil fuels, and in many cases, machines became a substitute for human labor. It was a revolution. Not fought with blood, bullets, and bombs, but with imagination, intelligence, and ingenuity. It led to enormous economic wealth, prosperity, and permanent environmental change. But, as with numerous other triumphs over nature, there lurks sinister snags. And today we are beginning to recognize that much of what fueled the Industrial Revolution's advances are no longer sustainable. However, in the 1800s, as transportation became more available, people were on the move. During that time, the promise of fertile land for agriculture was a major catalyst that motivated European migrations into the Great Lakes Basin. And by 1808, armed with new mechanical technology, one of the first skirmishes of the Industrial Revolution was to improve on nature and create a man-made inland waterway to link Buffalo, New York, to Albany. The Erie Canal was completed in late October of 1825. It was considered at the time to be a triumph of engineering. Some even called it the eighth wonder of the world. The original canal was only 4 feet deep and about 40 feet wide, but it allowed for boats to carry up to 30 tons of cargo. It carried settlers west and freight east. It was cheap. It was easy. It was just the beginning. By 1903, the canal and its locks had been greatly enlarged. At its peak, traffic had been increased to 4,000 boats with a workforce of 25,000 men and barges that could carry up to 3,000 tons of cargo. Today, the swirling waters that fill those very same locks carry only memories. Though the Industrial Revolution was seen as a revolution without an enemy, in the Great Lakes Basin, the Erie Canal opened the floodgates to an unforeseen invasion. Along with providing economic prosperity, much of the freight and people transiting the canal brought an assortment of biological species that were alien to the Great Lakes Basin. Freed from the natural competition that existed in their home environment, these would soon change the environmental landscape in the Great Lakes Basin forever. A biological menagerie that was hitching a free ride into an environmental wonderland.
So people were surveying plants in Michigan since the 1700s, and we can track the arrival of exotic plants in Michigan, and there is a definite jump in them once transportation systems become more available. And the opening of the Erie Canal is a great example. We have a series of invaders that made it to Michigan after the opening of the Erie Canal that opened up easy transport. So there is natural spread, and then there's human influence spread. And the human influence is part of the reason that we have so many invasive species right now.
The canal removed historical and natural geographic barriers. It provided a biological superhighway for exotic plants, insects, and aquatic species never before found in the Great Lakes Basin. Many of these new species were brought intentionally, both for profit as well as cultural familiarity. At the time, their environmental impact was unknown. But once they had become established, most would remain, and many, like purple loosestrife, would thrive. Unwelcomed guests from foreign ports.
So the largest number of exotic organisms that we know about in Michigan are plants. In fact, about 1/3 of our flora, 1 out of every 3 plant species in Michigan, is not native to Michigan. So plants are a major group of exotic species in our state. So it's pretty difficult for a plant which is rooted in the soil to get from Europe to North America without human assistance. Purple loosestrife probably came in on a trading ship. It invades wetland habitats, so wetlands are its natural habitat. And in Europe, it's a common wetland plant, part of the natural wetland ecosystem, and tends not to become a very dominant plant. But here in North America, when it invades a wetland, it actually tends to become one of the dominant plants in that wetland, and it starts to begin to exclude other plants and animals from that system.
Nearly a century after its introduction, by 1985, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service launched an international research project to discover a means of controlling the spread of purple loosestrife. It took a decade of research to find a safe biological control. This is one of the results. Commonly known as the black-margined loosestrife beetle, this small European insect has become a hero in the Great Lakes Basin. Only able to survive on a strict diet of loosestrife, its larva feeds on the plant's buds, and as it matures, it strips the foliage. Although total elimination of the plant is not possible, it does reduce the plant's overall dominance and has been considered a success. Economic and political pressures to develop the Great Lakes Basin, along with the Western Territories, would soon lead to greater and bolder engineering enterprises. One of the major obstacles to Western expansion was this. Niagara Falls. When first seen by Europeans, they were a wonder to behold, both majestic and frightening. Word soon spread that they must be seen to be believed. The early journeys to the falls were long, hard, and dangerous, pilgrimages through miles of wilderness. But as Europeans continued their push westward, the falls became more of an economic barrier that new technologies born of the Industrial Revolution would soon conquer. In 1824, ground was broken for the construction of the first Welland Canal, and by its completion in 1829, it would successfully bypass Niagara Falls, connecting Lake Ontario with Lake Erie. But this triumph of technology also included a hidden environmental disaster that no one ever expected. Lurking just beneath the surface in the Welland Canal were the first generations of sea lamprey from the Atlantic. They would soon make the Great Lakes their new home, and by the time they were discovered, it was already too late.
But with the opening of the Welland and the Erie canals back in the 1800s, it was able to then have a portal into the upper Great Lakes, but it really didn't take off until about the 1920s. And then it was found in Lake Erie, and then it went into Huron, Michigan, and Superior. And by the 1950s, it was just very prolific, and in turn, so between the overharvest and sea lamprey predation in its adult parasitic form on lake trout, the lake trout stocks were just decimated. So we lost a top predator, and a very important top predator, which then had complete food web disruption, as it's called. And then another non-native organism, known as the alewife, again native to the North Atlantic, was in the system. It no longer had predatory pressure by the lake trout, so it was able to proliferate, and by the mid-1960s there were massive die-offs of alewife washing up on the shores of the Great Lakes, creating a lot of damage from a recreational standpoint, a commercial, and everything else.
The conquest of natural barriers that only a short time before seemed unthinkable became commonplace. The Industrial Revolution was picking up steam. America was transforming. Agriculture was losing ground. The age of the machine was the future. It allowed for the creation of new things in new ways. It would also cause enormous changes in the natural landscape and waterways.
People began looking at the economic opportunities of Michigan, and of course the number one economic opportunity at that time was white pine. The value of the pine lands that we had in Michigan were enormous. Pine is a very strong building material, and at that time in the 1830s and 40s, balloon framing, the way we use 2x4s now to build the frame of a house, was coming into style. So pine was a strong material, but it was also lightweight. It was easy to transport because it floated well. And throughout western Michigan, we had a transportation system that would allow these pine logs to be floated down to cities like Saginaw, Muskegon, White Lake, Traverse City, and so on, where they could be produced into the lumber. The area that we're talking about, if you were to take your map of Michigan and to draw a line from about Grand Haven over to the Saginaw area, we're talking about everything north of that line up to the Straits, and then of course you had the Upper Peninsula, which was also pine lands. It was estimated that it would take 500 years to cut all of that lumber. In truth, it took about 50 years. The lumber of Michigan spread out through the entire United States. When it got to Chicago, which was the main shipping center, it was sent east and west on the railroads. And so the tenements that were being constructed in New York City at the time were built out of Michigan lumber. When you look at a sod house on the prairie in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, you'll notice that it has a wooden door and it has wooden windows. That wood came from Michigan. So the wood from Michigan literally built the entire United States for the latter half of the 19th century. If you had traveled through the northern half of the lower peninsula of Michigan in about 1910, it probably would have looked like the surface of the moon. It was just clear-cut, just big tree stumps everywhere. Very, very unattractive area.
By the beginning of the 1900s, the lumber industry had virtually stripped much of the Midwest landscape. Most of the pine and many of the hardwood forests were gone. The lumber industry was heading west in search of virgin territory.
We find the conversion from lumbering to industrialization happening right around 1900. There's a number of reasons for this. The lumbering era is coming to an end. There are a number of industries which are beginning to develop and to grow, for instance, the auto industry. And other industries are brought into Michigan through economic incentives. Many areas begin to attract and bring in new industries. There's still a number of natural resources. There's still a great deal of water. There's still a great deal of sand, which can be used for foundry work. And there's also a labor pool, the former lumbermen, that can be put to work. So in the eastern part of the state, we see the beginnings of the auto industry. Here in the western part of the state, we see the beginnings of foundry work, gray iron, and other forms of industrialization.
In the Great Lakes Basin, the transformation from agriculture to industry didn't happen overnight. Not even the First World War had much of an impact.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
However, by Sunday, December 7th, 1941, much of the Midwest had been transformed.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
By the beginning of World War II, those industries were now 30, 40 years old. They're mature industries. They have the capability to gear up to produce a wide variety of war material. When America enters into the war, it becomes the arsenal. It produces the material that the Russians, the British, that the entire world needs to defeat the Axis. And so all of these industries gear up. And of course, Detroit gears up and is producing tanks, jeeps, airplanes, ships.
By the end of World War II, the world had changed. America was on the cusp of becoming a superpower, and American industry had evolved into a formidable manufacturing force.
You could look at the Second World War and you could see the triumph of technology. It's not just the triumph of people, but it's the triumph of that technology that goes with the Second World War. And for many people in the 40s and the 50s after the war, there was the belief that you could then use that to turn inward on your own society and make it better. And so making or improving on the Great Lakes became a way of thinking about the St. Lawrence Seaway. It was an improvement on nature. It takes something like the automotive industry expanding to where it realizes, oh, we can carry things cheaper on Great Lakes steamers than by rail. Let's build a better entrance to take us out to the Atlantic seaboard.
Access from the Atlantic into the Great Lakes by way of the St. Lawrence River was first proposed in 1909, but it wasn't until 1954, when the Canadian government threatened to build the seaway unilaterally, that the U.S. joined in. The United States and Canada formed an alliance to conquer this natural barrier and further development of both countries. The St. Lawrence Seaway was to be an economic umbilical cord, which would sustain a global connection for trade and employment. The 2,342-mile seaway was opened for business on June 26, 1959. It was the missing link. With its completion, the Great Lakes Basin became the epicenter for an entire new breed of biological invaders, and they would soon lead the attack on America's heartland.
To me, the real tragedy is that the scientists in Canada discovered in 1981 that ships were importing huge numbers of foreign species in their ballast tanks. They documented, they did the study, they found that every ship they tested that came into Montreal was loaded with foreign species in its ballast water. So they did this study, they presented it to the US and Canadian Coast Guards, and the two agencies looked at the study and said, we're not convinced, and we're not going to do anything. So nothing was done. That was 1981. 7 years later, we found zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. It's a US and Canadian issue. It's a continental issue. Zebra mussels are now found in 23 states. Quagga mussels have spread as far west as California. And there are some scientists who believe that quagga mussels will cause more damage in the waters of the West than they caused in the Great Lakes. And, you know, most of the experts agree that if you're trying to sort of pin down which of these invaders has been the worst, most scientists will point to the quagga mussel because it's changed the lake's ecosystem from bottom to top.
These waterborne biological releases have, over the years, caused dramatic and irreversible environmental changes in and around the Great Lakes Basin.
Lake Michigan is a really good case study of how these mussels are changing the lakes. A species of freshwater shrimp called Diparia. It's the single most important source of fish food in the Great Lakes. And these things were incredibly abundant. You know, they could find thousands of them in a square meter of the lake bottom in 1995. So over the past 14 years, quagga mussels moved in, and Diparia is almost gone from Lake Michigan. And the quagga mussel population has just exploded. There are now about 500 million pounds of quagga mussels in Lake Michigan, which breaks down to over 300 trillion individual mussels. So these things are covering the bottom of the lake, and they're filtering out the plankton out of the water column, and it sort of sets off this domino effect that just goes up through the food chain. The quagga mussel is a relative of the zebra mussel, but it's like a zebra mussel on steroids. It can live in colder, deeper water. It can attach to anything, where zebra mussels have to have a hard surface to cling to. And some of the biggest changes are that these mussels come in and they filter the water. Each mussel can filter up to 1 liter of water per day. So they make the water more clear. And then sunlight penetrates deeper in the water and more algae grows. And then when the wind kicks up and the waves kick up, the algae breaks off the bottom of the lake, washes up on the beaches, and makes the beach essentially useless. They've also caused these botulism outbreaks, which have killed over 70,000 water birds around the Great Lakes over the past 10 years. And then one of the most alarming things that's happening now is that these mussels are spreading across the continent. And the scientists are finding that wherever these mussels invade, these toxic algae blooms tend to follow, which is a really potentially serious problem. The salmon are smaller, whitefish are smaller, and so really profound changes caused by these mussels. And these mussels, coupled with some of these other invaders, have sort of plunged the Great Lakes into this state of biological chaos.
As the Industrial Revolution has passed into history and its benefits have been incorporated into our daily lives, the speed and ease of transporting goods, people, and many unintended biological invaders has caused significant ecological changes in the existing environment.
It's a human-driven disaster. People messed up and brought this beetle in and released it, and it's going to be a long time before we have anything, even if we were to find resistant species or resistant individuals, you can't replace tens of millions, hundreds of millions of ash trees. The ash trees in North America have never really been exposed to an insect like this before, and they've never had any reason to evolve any sort of defenses for an insect like this. And so they tend to be much less resistant and much more vulnerable. We've tried to estimate how many trees have died, and our estimates are based on the inventory of ash trees. We have data from forest ash trees and from city ash trees, and we know a sizable proportion of those have died in southeast Michigan, for example. And our best guess is somewhere around 40 million ash trees in lower Michigan have died. That could be closer to 50 million. Nationwide, it's certainly something above and beyond 60 million trees. The emerald ash borer has become the most destructive forest insect to ever invade North America, both in terms of the numbers of trees that have died and in terms of the economic impacts to private landowners, communities, public lands, you name it. It seems anywhere there's ash trees, it's having an effect. It actually came into the Detroit area first. It probably came in with solid wood packing material, things like pallets and crates that are used on container ships. We know that it was here by at least the early 1990s, and it took until 2002 before the populations built up and people started to pay attention and we actually got it identified. There are certainly natural enemies of emerald ash borer in China, but I think by and large it has to do with this interaction between the trees and the insect and just the stronger resistance that you find in China. And the economists, they looked at the impact in terms of dollars for municipalities and private landowners that have ash landscape trees, ash shade trees. And the net result was that over the next 10 years, a very conservative estimate of the economic impacts of ash borer, if you add the suburbs and bedroom communities, then the number of ash trees doubles and you're up into a $20 billion economic cost just over the next 10 years, just for landscape trees.
So teams of researchers from this country were sent to China. First, they had to locate a viable population of EAB there. Once that happened, they collected the EAB life stages and they examined them essentially for anything that would appear out of the ordinary. So an external parasite would be a larva living on the larva of the EAB, for example. Once they had a sample of those, they attempted to rear them in larger quantities so that they could be studied for that environmental assessment, for example. And then only after all those steps were completed did we build this facility and begin to mass rear them. So what we do here is we collect emerald ash borers in various stages of their development. We bring them to the lab, and then we use them to grow a large number of our parasitic wasps. These parasitic wasps are small insects, about 1 centimeter long at the most. They do not sting humans. They use their reproductive organ like a stinger to lay an egg into or on an emerald ash borer, either an egg or a larva. Once they do that here in the lab, we allow them to go through their life cycle. And once we have a sufficient quantity of them at the right time of year, we ship them to our state cooperators, and they are released into the field against natural populations of EAB. There are 3 different kinds of wasps because each attacks either a different stage of EAB or at a different time of year. So for example, Oobius attacks the egg stage of EAB. These are a solitary parasite, so they kill one egg. Each time that female wasp lays one of her eggs, it kills one emerald ash borer egg. She can parasitize multiple EAB eggs in her life, and that would prevent a larva from ever entering the tree. For those that escape that first level of parasitism, they would then become a larva and begin to grow. Tetrasticus will begin to parasitize EAB in its 3rd growth stage, or instar. We refer to it as an instar. At that point, the larva is half grown and is still continuing to feed on the tree. The prepupal phase of the EAB, as it begins to dig into the wood, can be attacked by both Tetrasticus and also by Spathius. And because of these 3 levels of kind of protection, if you will, we hope to effect a more complete control of EAB than any one of those 3 species could offer us alone. Before we were allowed to release them anywhere, we had to go through an environmental assessment. And what that is we basically look at the potential effect that the release of these wasps would have on our natural environment here in North America. So we look at, most importantly, what the effect of the wasp would be on native relatives, cousins of EAB, and to see whether or not the wasps will attack them also. That step has been completed, and there was a finding of no significant impact. And that means we have determined that the release of these insects does not have a significant chance of having a negative impact on our environment. This year we have released over 5,000 Oobius thus far. We are on track to produce probably close to 100,000 Tetrasticus and about 50,000 Spathius. And next year we would like to see production grow even more than that. Basically all of the Great Lakes states will receive parasitoids in the very near future if they have not already. We have already completed releases in Minnesota, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and we have on the list for next year probably also Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, and Wisconsin. What we hope to see here is some measure of control against EAB where we could either slow down or prevent tree mortality. We will better know the answer to that question in the years ahead as we are able to produce and release more of these wasps to more areas around the country that are infested with EAB and look to see if there are positive effects on the trees.
In the early 1800s, Chicago, Illinois was suffering growing pains. The amount of sewage the city was pouring into the Chicago River was mixing with its supply of drinking water, Lake Michigan. People were getting sick. By 1860, the Chicago Board of Health formed a committee to come up with a solution. 5 years later, on February 16, 1865, the Illinois State Assembly approved what would at the time become the largest construction project in the history of the United States. It was front-page news. The plan was to reverse the flow of the Chicago River and carry the city's sewage away from Lake Michigan, down the Des Plaines and Missouri rivers, and into the Mississippi. The rush to complete the canal that would provide Chicago with clean drinking water took 7 years. But even when the work was over, people were still in a hurry. The law required water to be flowing into the canal before the governor would declare the project officially open. St. Louis, Missouri had filed a lawsuit in an attempt to block the project's completion. A federal injunction would soon be on its way. So on a wintry morning in January of 1900, in contrast to the hoopla surrounding the start of the project, only 9 sanitary trustees and about 50 Illinois citizens unceremoniously stood around hastily built fires trying to stay warm. They were watching workers in Big Dredge Number 7 laboring to break through the frozen clay that would allow water into the newly constructed canal. After several hours of toil, only 8 feet of rock-hard clay stood between triumph and failure. Finally, with the help of several sticks of dynamite, extraordinary efforts by man, machine, and several shovel-wielding trustees, at 10:35 a.m., the murky water finally began to flow. In the following day's edition, one major newspaper proclaimed, "Shouts of 'It's open! It's open!' went up from scores of throats." They beat both the injunction and Mother Nature. It too was reported as another triumph of technology. But, in time, Mother Nature would have the last word. It was mid-June of 1993. Nearly a century had passed since the opening of the Chicago Sanitary and Shipping Canal. A perfect storm was brewing over the Midwest, and what began as just another rainy day soon reached biblical proportions. It rained for more than 40 days and nights from mid-June through late August. Some areas reported over 40 inches. By the time the rain had stopped, nothing would ever be the same. Nearly 50 people had died, and more than 50,000 homes were destroyed. But even as the disaster faded into memory, the effects lingered. Lurking deep in the waters of the muddy Mississippi thrived a legacy of the Great Flood of '93, and soon the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal would splash back onto the front page. A new biological threat was slowly swimming up the Mississippi toward the man-made shipping canal that now linked with the Great Lakes. Several species of these carp call the United States home, and although they were brought here for the best of intentions, they could place the Great Lakes in harm's way. When brought to the United States, they were considered an invasive species and were confined to fish farms along the floodplains of the Mississippi. Their primary purpose was to help reduce the amount of chemicals that were being used to control aquatic vegetation. But in 1993, when the floodwaters overflowed into their holding tanks, they simply swam up the river. It was an invitation they couldn't refuse.
Now they're in the Chicago Sanitary and Shipping Canal. And so the U.S. government has put an electric barrier in the canal to try to keep the fish from migrating into Lake Michigan.
It too, like the construction of the shipping canal, carried a price tag of $30 million. And it was hoped that under ideal circumstances, it would repel the hungry invaders. But in 2010, hope turned into desperation. Asian carp DNA was discovered in the Calumet Harbor in Lake Michigan. And soon a legal battle between the economic forces that depend on the canal for commerce and those that fear an ecological disaster for the Great Lakes had begun. A breach of the barrier would put the Great Lakes' $7 billion fishing industry at risk.
The scientists who I talk to and tend to put a lot of respect in, they think it's inevitable that the Asian carp will invade the Great Lakes.
There's probably a pretty good chance that Asian carp is going to get here to the Great Lakes. I mean, it's close enough now that it's probably going to get here.
In July of 2010, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania filed lawsuits aimed at temporarily closing the canal's locks until a permanent solution could be found. But as the legal battles rage, some think it's all too little, too late.
Rapid response teams, if they find the Asian carp in the Great Lakes, they're going to go out and kill every last one of them. I say good luck. I'm very skeptical.
Round, round, get around, I get around, yeah, get around, round, round.
lot of scientists I talk to seem to think that these carp will do really well in areas where we have carp now. So in warm, murky rivers like the Grand River in southern Michigan, and the Maumee River in Ohio, rivers like that, these things could take hold and multiply like crazy. And the concerns with these fish are twofold. One is some of them are very large. The big head carp can grow to 100 pounds. And it's just like an eating machine that will go after the base of the food chain. And then the silver carp jumps out of the water when boat motors go by. For some reason, the sound of a boat motor just makes these fish lose their mind, and they literally rocket out of the water. It's not a leisurely jump. It's like a rocket coming out. I know because I've been hit by these fish down on the Illinois River. I went out to this, there's an annual event down in Bath, Illinois called the Redneck Fishing Tournament. And the sole purpose is to go out and kill as many of these carp as you can. And there's lots of beer and bad live music involved.
Get around, round, round, I get around. Get around, round, I get around. Get around, round, I get around. Get around.
I mean, these invasives, they clog our waterways, they harm the fishing industry, they hurt farmers every time there's a new terrestrial invasive species. I mean, farmers are going to have to deal with that. The people who manage our wildlife areas have to deal with these things. It really affects our economy in a huge way. If we could simply stop an invasive species from entering the Great Lakes region in the first place, we would save millions or billions of dollars. They have a huge economic impact, and I think we're just beginning to see the start of that. I mean, I think that the impact will be even greater in the future because there's no shortage of species that haven't yet made their way here that could in the future. And if we don't do something to stop it, we'll have more invasive species than we've ever had, and we'll spend more every single year than we ever have in the past to control them.
Environment has been a production of Michigan State University's Knight Center for Environmental Journalism.